Part 1, Chuck E. Cheese, Where the Night Begins. I didn't expect to spend my Saturday night trapped inside a Chuck E. Cheese. I mean, who would? It started as a dare, my friends egging me on, laughing over greasy pizza and soggy fries, saying I wouldn't last 1 hour alone after closing. The whole thing sounded absurd, like a joke from one of those viral internet challenges, but I wasn't one to back down. The manager was easy to bribe. A quick $50 in cash and a promise not to touch anything expensive was all it took. "Just lock the doors behind you when you're done," he muttered, like I was some delinquent teen loitering at a mall. He didn't even ask why. That should have been my first clue something wasn't right. When the lights dimmed at 9 p.m. and the last toddler had been dragged out kicking and screaming, the staff filed out too quickly, leaving me alone with the faint hum of the animatronics. The place felt different now, like stepping into a funhouse after the carnival closed. The vibrant murals of Chuck and his friends loomed like sentinels, their painted smiles fixed, their glassy eyes catching the faint glow of the security lights. My first hour was uneventful. I wandered around, occasionally glancing at the mascot stage. The animatronics stood in their stiff, lifeless poses. Chuck, Helen, Jasper, and the rest. They didn't move, didn't so much as twitch. I joked aloud to myself, "Guess you guys aren't as creepy as the internet says." My voice echoed across the empty dining area. It started subtly. A faint crackling sound, like static interference, trickled through the speakers. I froze, straining my ears. The cheerful jingle from earlier had stopped, replaced by faint, distorted whispers. Faulty equipment, I told myself, but my fingers tightened on my phone, the only source of light aside from the weak glow of the stage. The first true scare came when I passed the prize counter. A row of cheap plastic trinkets gleamed under the fluorescent light. I felt a faint breeze, a cold draft cutting through the stagnant air. That shouldn't have been possible. I turned around, expecting to see a vent or some opening, but there was nothing. Just rows of empty tables and chairs. Then I saw it. A figure darted past the far end of the dining area. Just a shadow, quick and fluid. My heart stopped for a beat before logic kicked in. "Security guard," I whispered, convincing myself I wasn't alone. I called out, "Hello? Anyone there?" No answer. The silence wrapped around me like a suffocating blanket. I turned on my flashlight and aimed it at the stage. The animatronics were different. Chuck E. Cheese wasn't standing anymore. He was slumped forward, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, staring directly at me. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I hadn't heard him move. To be continued. Part 2, the game begins. My breathing quickened, the beam of my flashlight trembling as it illuminated Chuck E.'s grotesque, unblinking gaze. His slackened jaw seemed to stretch wider than it should have, as though caught mid-scream. I told myself it had to be my imagination, or worse, a poorly programmed animatronic glitch. "All right, very funny," I called out, forcing bravado into my voice. "You can stop messing with me now." But who was I even talking to? The silence returned, broken only by the faint hum of machinery behind the walls. I backed away slowly, unwilling to take my eyes off the animatronic, when I noticed something else. Helen Henny, the cheerfully feathered bird that had been standing beside Chuck earlier, wasn't on the stage anymore. I whipped my flashlight around the room, scanning every corner. Nothing. My mind raced. Had someone moved it? Was this part of some elaborate prank? The whispers returned, faint but persistent, like voices trying to form words just beyond comprehension. They didn't come from the speakers this time. They seemed to echo from deep within the walls, rising and falling like waves. I edged toward the exit, ready to abandon the dare entirely. But when I reached the main doors, I froze. The lock that the manager had told me to secure, it wasn't locked anymore. Worse, the chain that had been wrapped around the handles now dangled limply from the door, swinging ever so slightly. That cold breeze returned, stronger now, curling around my ankles. "This isn't funny anymore," I shouted into the empty room, my voice bouncing off the walls like a taunt. Behind me, a faint click-clack-click echoed across the tiled floor. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like the sound of plastic scraping against the ground. My stomach knotted as I turned, flashlight trembling, to face the noise. The beam caught her mid-step. Helen Henny, her wide cartoonish grin fixed, her mechanical legs half bent as if caught backed up against the doors, fumbling with the lock. But my hands were shaking too much to fit the chain into place. Helen's head jerked toward me, her painted-on eyes staring blankly in my direction. For a moment, we both stood still. Then her body lurched forward. I dropped the chain and ran. The dining area was a maze of tables and chairs, and I knocked over several in my frantic escape. I skidded into the arcade section, the flashing lights from dormant machines casting jagged shadows on the walls. The whispers grew louder, echoing from every direction now, drowning out the pounding of my heart. I ducked behind the skee-ball machines, trying to calm my breathing. Stay quiet, stay hidden, I thought. But then I heard it, slow, deliberate footsteps, click, clack, click, followed by the sound of gears grinding. She was searching for me. I crouched lower, peeking through the small gap between the machines. Helen's shadow passed by, her jerky movements casting an almost puppet-like silhouette. I pressed a hand over my mouth to stifle a gasp as her head twisted unnaturally, scanning the room with a mechanical groan. When she finally moved out of sight, I dared to exhale. But my relief was short-lived. From somewhere behind me, I heard another noise, a low, guttural growl. My stomach flipped as I turned to face the source. From the darkness of the ball pit, two glowing eyes stared back at me. To be continued. Part 3, the ball pit. The eyes were impossibly bright, twin orbs cutting through the murky shadows of the ball pit. They didn't blink. They didn't shift. They just stared. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were cemented to the floor. The growl grew louder, rising into a distorted chittering sound, like static overlaid with a sinister giggle. My flashlight was still clutched in my hand, but I was too afraid to aim it at the ball pit. What if I actually saw what was in there? Before I could decide, the balls began to shift. Slowly at first, then faster, rippling like the surface of a disturbed pond. The eyes dipped beneath the surface, disappearing into the sea of cheap plastic. Get out of here. The thought finally broke through my paralysis. I stumbled backward, gripping the edge of the skee-ball machine for balance. My flashlight's beam swept wildly across the room, catching fleeting glimpses of movement, an animatronic, tail disappearing around a corner, the faint shimmer of reflective eyes watching me from afar. The whispers had transformed into laughter now, a cacophony of childlike giggles that echoed and overlapped, taunting me from every direction. My rational mind screamed that this wasn't possible. They're just broken robots, I told myself. This is a malfunction, a joke, a nightmare. I didn't believe a word of it. The laughter abruptly stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing down on me like a weight. Then I heard it, the rustling of plastic balls closer this time. I whipped my flashlight toward the pit, just in time to see a small figure begin to rise. It wasn't one of the animatronics. It was something else entirely, something that didn't belong. The thing was child-sized, its skin pale and mottled like old porcelain. Its face was a blank canvas, featureless except for a wide, toothy grin that stretched unnaturally across its smooth surface. It moved with an inhuman fluidity, pulling itself out of the ball pit with elongated fingers that bent at impossible angles. My flashlight flickered, and for one horrifying moment, I thought it might die. I backed away, too terrified to take my eyes off the creature. Its head tilted as if curious, and then it spoke, its voice a raspy imitation of a child's.
Play with me.
I bolted, sprinting toward the kitchen area, my flashlight swinging wildly. Behind me, I could hear the creature's distorted giggling, followed by the frantic rustling of the ball pit as it gave chase. I slammed through the double doors of the kitchen and locked them behind me, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The kitchen was pitch black, the only light coming from my faltering flashlight. The air smelled stale, like burnt pizza and cleaning chemicals. I scanned the room, looking for a place to hide, when a sudden crash made me whip around. A metal tray had fallen to the floor, clattering noisily against the tiles. My flashlight landed on the source, a human figure slumped against the wall. For a moment, I thought it was another prank, a mannequin set up to scare me. But as I crept closer, I realized with horror that it was a real person. His uniform was tattered and stained, and his face was pale and gaunt, as though he hadn't seen sunlight in weeks. He lifted his head weakly, his eyes bloodshot and hollow. "Get out," he croaked, his voice barely a whisper. "You shouldn't have come here." Before I could respond, the doors rattled violently. The creature was trying to get in. The man's eyes widened in panic. "It's too late," he rasped. "You're part of it now." The laughter resumed, louder and more distorted than before, as the doors burst open. To be continued? Part 4. The Heart of the Horror. The doors exploded open, slamming against the walls with a force that shook the entire room. I fell backward, the flashlight tumbling from my hands and rolling across the floor, casting frantic sweeping beams of light. The thing from the ball pit stood in the doorway, its elongated fingers gripping the frame as it tilted its head, staring at me with that grotesque, grinning mask of a face. The laughter was deafening now, reverberating off the stainless steel surfaces of the kitchen. Behind the creature, shadows twisted and writhed, forming shapes that shouldn't have been possible. Something else was coming. The man slumped against the wall, reached out with trembling fingers, grabbing my wrist. His grip was weaker than I expected, but his urgency was unmistakable. "You have to stop it," he whispered, his voice rasping like sandpaper. "The shrine, it's the source. Destroy it or it won't let you leave." "Shrine?" I choked out, barely able to hear myself over the chaos. "Under the stage," he hissed. "Go now!" The creature lunged, its unnaturally long arms stretching toward me with terrifying speed. I scrambled to my feet, narrowly avoiding its grasp, and snatched up my flashlight. The man let out a guttural scream as the creature turned its attention to him, pouncing with feral speed. I didn't look back. I bolted through the kitchen's opposite door, bursting into the dining area once more. The space felt different now, smaller, darker, as if the walls were closing in around me. The animatronics were no longer on the stage. I scanned the room frantically, my flashlight bouncing off overturned tables and shattered chairs. The whispers were everywhere now, layering over one another like a sinister chant. I forced myself to focus, replaying the man's words in my head. I ran toward the platform, my shoes slipping on something wet. I glanced down and froze. The floor was smeared with dark, viscous streaks that glistened under the flashlight's beam. My stomach churned, but I pressed on, climbing onto the stage. The air felt heavier here, thick with an oppressive energy that made it hard to breathe. I dropped to my knees and began searching for anything that could resemble a hatch or a trapdoor. Behind me, I heard the sound of gears grinding. My blood ran cold. Slowly, I turned my head. Chuck E. Cheese stood at the edge of the stage, his mechanical body twitching and jerking as though caught in an invisible current. His head tilted, his glassy eyes locking onto mine. His mouth opened, emitting a burst of distorted static that morphed into a warped, broken version of his signature catchphrase. "Smile, you're gonna love it here. Forever." With a deafening screech, Chuck lunged. I threw myself to the side, rolling off the stage, just as his heavy metal frame crashed into the spot where I'd been kneeling. Sparks flew as his limbs spasmed uncontrollably, his head swiveling 360 degrees like a possessed doll. My flashlight caught the glint of something beneath the stage, a seam in the wood, barely visible in the chaos. The hatch. I crawled toward it, my fingers scrabbling against the splintered surface. Chuck's mechanical arm slammed down beside me, narrowly missing my hand. I gritted my teeth and yanked on the hatch, my heart pounding as it finally gave way. A staircase descended into darkness. Without a second thought, I plunged into the abyss, slamming the hatch shut behind me. The whispers followed me down. The air in the underground chamber was suffocating, thick with the stench of decay. My flashlight flickered, its weak beam barely illuminating the narrow, claustrophobic space. The walls were lined with tattered posters of Chuck E. Cheese and his friends, their smiling faces warped and distorted with age. At the center of the room was the shrine. It was unmistakable. A crude altar constructed from broken animatronic parts, their wires coiled like snakes around a pedestal. Atop it sat a headless figure, its body adorned with symbols that pulsed with a sickly red glow. Surrounding the altar were dozens of photographs, all of children, smiling, laughing, their eyes filled with innocent joy. The whispers crescendoed, the air vibrating with an unnatural hum. The shrine seemed to pulsate as if alive, and I could feel its pull, a dark, magnetic force that made my skin crawl. I stepped closer, my hands trembling. "Destroy it," the man had said. But how? A sharp clang above me shattered my focus. The hatch had been thrown open. They were coming. Part 5. The Descent into Madness. The hatch slammed against the floor, echoing through the underground chamber. I stumbled backward, staring up as shadows spilled into the space like living smoke. First came Helen, her head cocked unnaturally to the side, one eye missing, wires dangling like exposed veins. Then Chuck E., dragging his mangled frame, his joints grinding and sparking with every step. Behind them, the faceless creature from the ball pit slithered down the stairs, its elongated limbs twisting impossibly as it crawled along the walls. The whispers were deafening now, overlapping voices blending into one terrible chant. The air grew colder with each passing second, frost forming on the damp walls. Destroy it, I reminded myself. But what could I do? I didn't even know where to begin. The shrine pulsed, the red symbols glowing brighter as the animatronics descended. My head throbbed as the oppressive energy seemed to seep into my skull, filling my mind with flashes of horrific images, empty playgrounds, broken toys, smiling children turning to ash. My legs felt like jelly, but I forced myself to move. I lunged for the shrine, grabbing the first piece of it I could reach, a jagged fragment of a robot arm. The second my fingers touched it, a searing pain shot through my hand, and I cried out, dropping the piece. The whispers turned into mocking laughter. "You can't stop us," the voices hissed, the words slithering into my ears like venom. Behind me, I heard Chuck's heavy footsteps closing in. I whirled around, narrowly dodging as his clawed hand swiped at my face. I grabbed the flashlight from my belt and swung it like a bat, striking his head with a sickening crunch. Sparks flew and he staggered, but it only bought me a moment. The faceless creature lunged next, its wiry limbs propelling it forward like a spider. I kicked at it, my foot connecting with its torso, but the impact barely slowed it down. Its grin widened impossibly, revealing rows of jagged yellowed teeth. I fell back against the shrine, my head spinning. Think, there has to be a way. My eyes darted around the room, landing on a rusted crowbar half buried in a pile of debris. I dove for it, snatching it up just as Helen's mechanical arm lashed out, narrowly missing my leg. With the crowbar in hand, I turned to the shrine. "You want this so bad?" I growled. "Then let's see what happens when it's gone." I swung the crowbar down with all my strength, shattering one of the glowing symbols. The room immediately erupted in chaos. The whispers turned to shrieks, high-pitched and ear-splitting, as the air seemed to ripple with rage. The animatronics spasmed violently, their movements becoming erratic and jerky. I didn't stop. I swung again and again, smashing pieces of the altar until the red glow began to fade. The ground trembled beneath my feet, cracks spidering out from the shrine and snaking up the walls. Helen let out a distorted screech, her body collapsing into a heap of metal and wires. Chuck fell to his knees, his glowing eyes flickering before going dark. The faceless creature writhed, its limbs flailing as it let out an inhuman wail. The shrine gave one final pulse, the symbols flashing a blinding white light before exploding into a shower of sparks. I was thrown backward, landing hard on the cold, damp floor. When I opened my eyes, the room was still. The oppressive energy was gone, replaced by an eerie silence. The animatronics lay in pieces, lifeless and broken. The faceless creature was nowhere to be seen, its presence erased as though it had never existed. I forced myself to my feet, my entire body aching. The staircase loomed above me, the hatch now closed, the red glow extinguished. I climbed the steps cautiously, half expecting something to lunge at me from the shadows. But when I pushed open the hatch, I found the dining area bathed in pale morning light. The restaurant was empty, its cheerful murals and arcade games now feeling like relics of a distant nightmare. I stumbled toward the exit, my legs barely carrying me, and pushed open the front doors. The cool morning air hit my face, and I collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for breath. I didn't look back. I didn't care to know if the restaurant was still standing, if the horrors I'd faced would ever be uncovered by someone else. I only knew that I had survived. But as I staggered to my car, my ears still ringing with phantom whispers, I realized I could never escape what I had seen. There are some places in this world where the line between reality and nightmare blurs. Some places where darkness thrives, waiting for someone foolish enough to wander in. Chuck E. Cheese wasn't a family restaurant. It was a hunting ground, and I'd only barely made it out alive.